Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. I am reading through Patriots History of the United States, the great book written by myself and Michael Allen, now in its 40th printing, 15th anniversary edition, which is the one I am using here. As always, if you have an earlier edition, the page numbers will probably not line up, but the headers should. And our current header is a republic if you can keep it. So that's where we are in the book. Now, a little housekeeping note, there will be no reading on Friday, as I will be at the Great Homeschool Convention in Austin, Texas. So if you're in Texas and you come by the convention, make sure you bring your book for me to autograph it. Stop by the booth. I don't know what booth I'll be, but you can find out easily enough. I'm also giving talks on both Friday and Saturday, same subject, Pillars of American Exceptionalism. And also, if you haven't noticed, I am the feature story in World Magazine out this 4th of July weekend, which is called An Exception to the Rule, about the 4 pillars of American exceptionalism. So we're going to continue now with our discussion of the U.S. Constitution. I am on page 123. Delegates to the Constitutional Convention thus arrived at the point at which they all knew they would come. Americans had twice before skirted the issue of slavery or avoided dealing with it. In 1619, when Black slaves were first unloaded off ships, colonists had the opportunity and responsibility to insist on their emancipation immediately and unconditionally, yet they did not. Then again in 1776, when Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence and included the indictment of Great Britain's imposition of slavery on the colonies, pressure from South Carolina and other southern states forced him to strike it from the final version. Now in 1787, the young republic had a third opportunity, perhaps its last without bloodshed, to deal with slavery. Its delegates did not. Several examples can be cited to suggest that many of the delegates thought slavery was already headed for extinction. In 1776, the Continental Congress had reiterated a prohibition in the non-importation agreement against the importation of African slaves, despite repealing the rest. During the war, various proposals were submitted to the Congress to offer freedom after the conflict to slaves who fought for the American Revolution. Southern colonies blocked these. After the war, several northern states, including New Hampshire, 1779, Pennsylvania, 1780, Massachusetts, 1783, Rhode Island, 1784, Connecticut, 1784, all expressly forbade slavery in their constitutions, adopted immediate or gradual emancipation plans, or had courts declare slavery unconstitutional. Most encouraging to the anti-slave forces, however, in 1782, Virginia passed a law allowing slave owners discretion on freeing their slaves. Jefferson's own Notes on the State of Virginia imagined a time after 1800 when all slaves would be free, and Madison labeled pro-slavery arguments in 1790, quote, shamefully indecent, calling slavery, quote, a deep-rooted abuse. Founders such as Hamilton, who helped start the New York Manumission Society, and Franklin, whose last major public debate involved a satirical lambasting of slavery, had established their anti-slavery credentials. Perhaps the most radical and surprising was Washington, who alone among the Southern founders projected an America that included both Indians and freed slaves as citizens in a condition of relative equality. He even established funds to support the children of his wife's slaves after her death. His own slaves were freed in his last will and testament. Okay, now I know you're saying Jefferson didn't free his slaves. He didn't. And the obvious reason is Jefferson was broke. His plantation made a lot of money, but it spent a ton of money. He lived high on the hog, but he didn't make enough to live that well. And his whole plantation would have collapsed without slavery. Probably Washington's too. The fact is, most of these planters were land rich and cash poor. They were asset rich because if you added the assets of slaves and the land, on paper, they had tons of money, but they weren't generating that much cash to be able to economically free their slaves and still be comfortable. Now, I know morally, who cares about comfort? I'm just saying, they did not see themselves as economically being in a position to free their slaves. It would have been something that, if they were really economically well off, some might have considered it. But you've got to also remember the power angle inherent in slavery. And no legitimate historian overlooks this. Of course, slavery has a power component. And of course, as the institution went on over time, this power component became more and more entrenched, to the point that slaveless white farmers who own no slaves now found themselves in a power position over slaves, who, if they were free, might be their equals. And so the argument that, well, most of those who fought in the Civil War didn't own slaves, irrelevant, because they had a stake in the slave-holding society that was so powerful, they supported slavery whether they owned slaves or not. Even when they railed against the rich slave owners, and there were definitely class issues between the rich plantation owners and the yeoman farmers, no question about it. But when push came to shove, the number of yeoman farmers in the South in 1850 or 1855 who would have gone along with emancipation, you could probably count on one hand. Now, this notion that many of the founders thought slavery was just going to disappear, I don't know. I'm sure some of them genuinely believed it. But if you asked any of them, including Jefferson or Washington or Madison or Monroe, any of them, how exactly was that going to happen, Mr. Monroe? How exactly, what's the process, Mr. Madison, by which this would occur? They had no clue. There was no way in their structure it could occur. And in fact, as we're going to see over time, the more slaves who got their freedom, who engaged in manumission, who worked long enough to buy their own freedom or that of their families, they presented a threat to whites, because it showed, number one, that slaves were actually the equal of whites, that once freed, blacks could attain the same skills, the same success in business, even the same education. And so merely having freed blacks around became a problem. And what we're going to see is that as we get closer to the Civil War, Virginia especially begins to pass laws to kick these people out, that free blacks can no longer remain in Virginia because they constitute a threat. And so all of those forces or tendencies or possibilities that might, under an ideal system, have worked to force emancipation over time, such as these people all claim to think was going to happen, in reality, increasingly just the opposite was happening. They were getting fewer and fewer examples of free blacks to stand out, to convince some whites, oh, maybe this could work. Likewise, the struggle for territories. Now, look, I'm not comparing Nazi Germany to the American South. I am comparing the situation of expansion, and the situation of Germany's expansion prior to World War II was that they kept needing more and more border states, such as Poland or Czechoslovakia or Romania or whatever it is, because they were taking people in as slaves which meant that they still needed more territory to produce more food and raw materials for these people they now had to feed and sustain and house and so on and so forth. And so a similar, not exact, but a similar thing happens in the American South, where they find themselves needing more and more territories. Now, we went over last time how this moral imperative about property versus people that we looked at in the Northwest Ordinance, unfree persons, the founders got that right. And the founders set it up so inevitably the country would have to make a decision. Maybe it would be the courts, maybe it'd be the legislature, but sooner or later, somebody was going to have to make a decision on whether or not a slave is a person or a piece of property. And the Constitution says he's a person. So meanwhile, the South, seeing this struggle coming over this definition, begins to push slavery into the territories more and more and more. It was not just to maintain the balance in the Senate and the House. That's part of it, but that's not the main part. The main part was each side understood freedom national, slavery local. Remember, I went over this in a previous lesson, that freedom was put in the Northwest Ordinance and in the Constitution to be the national fallback, the national default. Slavery was local and considered an exception and an aberration. And sooner or later, you get rid of exceptions and aberrations. So the South understood this as well as the North, and they were pushing more and more territories so that slavery would become national, freedom local, and eventually, perhaps in their minds, the definition would come to be that slaves are property, not people. So again, I don't want to look at people's motivations that much. I mostly take them at their word. I'm not into psychohistory or getting into what do they really mean, what were they really saying. Pretty much if they said they thought it was going to be gone after 1800, I take them at their word, but I question, why did they think that? And to this historian's training, research, understanding, not one of them has provided a logical path by which they were going to get there. I think they all wanted it, but I think they all wanted it in a magical kind of hopium, no pain way. And it was always going to be very painful, not just the economic part, not just emancipation, but the more painful part is what we saw from 1865 to the 1960s. And that was the integration, the full integration of a minority race into the American body politic and American society. And once blacks did it, all other races, even though many of them outnumber blacks like Hispanics, came along. They came along. And that's why we had a recent court decision against affirmative action, which is terrific. Nobody should be granted access to a college because of their skin color, period. Nor should they be granted, in my view, access to a college university because of who their daddy was or their granddaddy was. It ought to be purely merit. And if you look back to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all these places in the early 1900s, you would see farmer sons from Nebraska and oilmen's daughters and sons from Texas and coal miners' relatives all going to these schools because they were smart and they had great ideas and they could write, they could think, they could invent. And you would see these kids mixed together, which you would never get today. Today, you have two classes of people in these schools. You have affirmative action babies who are allowed in solely because of their skin color. I said three classes. You have athletes who the colleges all need to keep the money churning. And then you have heritage kids People are in because who their daddy or granddaddy or family name was. And you know my feelings on this. We ought to get rid of all athletic scholarships. Pay them, or give them a full 4-year voucher if they want that instead to the university that they can use at any time, or transfer it to anybody. But we got to stop the academic money gravy train going to the colleges and universities. That's a big, big reason why they're able to get away with the garbage they get away with. And number two, we've got to get rid of all these legacy people who have no business being in school. It's just outrageous that some of these politicians' kids, these families just perpetuate themselves. And then, of course, we get rid of affirmative action. Everybody comes in by merit, period. So that's the skinny on the slavery issue here. The compromise over slavery did not come without a fight. Governor Morris, one of the most outspoken critics of slavery at the convention, attacked Wilson's fractional formula and asked of the slaves counted under the 3/5 rule, quote, are they admitted as citizens? That's a good question. Were indentured servants admitted as citizens? Then why are they not admitted on an equality with white citizens? Good question. Are they admitted as property? Then why are they not other property admitted to the computation? Exactly right. If you're going to count a slave as a piece of property, why not count that New York landowner, all of his land as votes? I mean, it's ridiculous. It's absurd. Morris and others, including Jefferson, recognized that slavery promised to inject itself into every aspect of American life. Consider comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, the principle that one state accepts the privileges and immunities of other states to encourage free travel and commerce between them. Article 4 required states to give, quote, full faith and credit to laws and judicial decisions of other states. Fugitives from justice were to be returned for trial to the state of their crime, for example. Almost immediately, conflicts arose when slaves escaped to northern states, which then refused to oblige southern requests for their return. Northern free blacks working in merchant marine found themselves unable to disembark from their ships in southern ports for fear of enslavement, regardless of their legal status. 7 southern coastal states actually imprisoned free black sailors upon their arrival in port. At the time, however, the likelihood that the Southerners would cause the convention to collapse meant that the delegates had to adopt the 3/5 provision and deal with the consequences later. Realistically, it was the best they could do, although it would take 78 years, a civil war, and 3 constitutional amendments to reverse the 3/5 compromise. Modern historians have leaped to criticize the convention's decision and could certainly apply the colloquial definition of a compromise, which is doing less than what you know is right. Historian Joseph Ellis noticed that, quote, the distinguishing feature of the Constitution when it came to slavery was its evasiveness, unquote. But let's be blunt. To oppress the slavery issue in 1776 would have killed the revolution, and to oppress it in 1787 would have aborted the nation. When the ink dried on the final drafts, the participants had managed to agree on most of the important issues, and where they still disagreed, they kept those divisions from distracting them from the task at hand. More important, the final document indeed represented all. Quote, this is Paul Johnson, by the way, in 560 roll calls, no state was always on the losing side, and each at times was part of the winning coalition, unquote. The framers were highly focused only on republic building, acting on the assumption that the Union was the highest good and that ultimately all problems, including slavery, would be resolved if they could only keep the country together long enough, which was Lincoln's view as well. We're going to keep the country together. If we have to fight, we'll do it. But once we keep the country together and fight, we're going to solve the slavery issue. From the outset, the proceedings had perched perilously on the verge of collapse, making the final document indeed a miracle. When the convention ended, a woman buttonholed Franklin and asked what kind of government the nation had. A republic, madam, if you can keep it. said Franklin. All right, so next time, and this won't be Friday, it'll be next Monday when I'm back. Next time, I'm going to start reading the Constitution. And again, I have already posted in some of the earlier descriptions my reading of several articles of the U.S. Constitution in another setting for the Faith and Freedom Foundation. But I'm going to read through the whole document starting on Monday, so you don't want to miss that. Now, again, help me make Patriots History into a video series, folks. This could be so powerful. If you've seen The Chosen and you like The Chosen, or if you saw John Adams, or if you saw Sons of Liberty, we can do this. I have the skilled people, the directors, the cameramen. By the way, an aside, one of the camera guys I use is named Mathers, Jim Mathers. His brother, Jerry Mathers, played the Beaver on Leave It to Beaver, but he's considered one of the best cameramen in LA. I've got the people, I've got the director. We can get the scripts. Alan Peterson and I can write the script to be fantastic, but we need the money. You just can't do this without money. It's not something that comes without money. And people always want to say, oh, well, you can go to Heritage, or you can go to American Enterprise, or you can go here, you can go. No, the think tanks don't want to fund videos, folks. They don't want to fund videos. I don't know what it is about them, but they're just opposed to funding videos. They want to do white papers, and they want to send Ben Shapiro to talk on a college campus. I've told you my thoughts on that. Ben's fine speaker, makes a powerful case at various times. He'll get 300 people to a talk, of whom 200 will be in his corner already. I did 2 PragerU videos. Each of them got over 1 million views. What's the best use of your money? How can you best influence people? Go watch the trailer and Wild World History and buy Larry a coffee. I'll see you guys back here next Monday.